Look at this photograph. Go ahead, really look at it. See that little girl in the white dress? The one standing next to the butcher's shop with that strange, hollow smile. Her name was Emily Thornwell, and in 1902, this single photograph exposed a secret so twisted, so unbelievable, that an entire town tried to burn every copy of it. They almost succeeded. But one copy survived, and tonight, I'm gonna tell you why they were so damn desperate to destroy it. This is the story of the butcher's daughter, and I'm warning you right now, this ain't your typical ghost story. This is real. This happened. And by the end of this, you're gonna wish you'd never seen that photograph. Let's get into it. The year is 1895. The place? Ashford Hollow, Pennsylvania. A nothing town. Population 847. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where secrets don't stay buried, and where folks mind their own damn business, until they can't anymore. Ashford Hollow sat in a valley between two mountains, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to close in tighter every year. The railroad didn't run through there. The main road was barely more than a dirt path. It was isolated, forgotten, the kind of place people ended up when they were running from something or had nowhere else to go. The town had one main street. You had your general store run by the Carter family, your post office where Mrs. Eliza Grant sorted mail and gossip in equal measure, your church, a small white building with a bell that cracked back in 1887 and nobody ever bothered to fix, and right smack in the middle, Thornwell's butcher shop. That place had been there for 3 generations. Samuel Thornwell ran it, just like his daddy before him, and his daddy before that. The Thornwells were the closest thing Ashford Hollow had to royalty. They owned the most land, employed the most people, and had their family name carved into the cornerstone of pretty much every important building in town. Now, Samuel. He was what you'd call a pillar of the community. 42 years old, built like an oak tree, with hands the size of dinner plates from years of working with meat and bone. Went to church every Sunday, always sat in the third pew on the right. Donated to the poor. Hell, he even funded the new schoolhouse in 1893, paid for it entirely out of his own pocket. People loved this guy. Trusted him. And why wouldn't they? Best cuts of meat in 3 counties, always gave fair prices, always had a smile for the ladies and a firm handshake for the men. He'd quote scripture while wrapping your beef roast, tell jokes while grinding your sausage. A real charmer. But here's the thing about small towns, everybody's got secrets. And Samuel Thornwell? His secret was bigger than anyone could have imagined. Samuel married late in life. He was 42 when he met Margaret Hayes, a quiet woman from Pittsburgh who'd come to Ashford Hollow in the summer of 1894 to escape something. Nobody asked what. In small towns, you don't pry when someone clearly don't want to be pried into. She was 35, which was considered old for a first-time bride back then. She was pretty in a faded kind of way, like a flower that had been pressed in a book too long. They got married in October of 1894. Small ceremony. Nothing fancy. Pastor Green officiated, and maybe 20 people showed up. Margaret wore a simple gray dress, not white, people noticed, and she cried through the entire ceremony. Some folks thought they were happy tears. Others weren't so sure. And exactly 9 months later, September 17, 1895, Margaret gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Emily. Now, here's where things get weird. The birth was rough. Real rough. Margaret was in labor for almost 2 days, and the screaming, God, the screaming. People could hear it from 3 houses away. Windows were closed, doors were shut, but those screams carried through the September air like something dying slowly. The town doctor, old Doc Patterson, he was there the whole time. Patterson was 73 years old, had been delivering babies in Ashford Hollow since before half the current residents were born. He'd seen it all, breech births, stillbirths, twins, triplets, every complication you could imagine. Nothing rattled him. Until that night. The midwife who was helping, Ida Blackwell, she was a hard woman. Had buried 3 husbands and delivered over 500 babies in her lifetime. Hands steady as stone, nerves like iron. She fainted. Just straight up collapsed when that baby came out. And Samuel Thornwell? He locked the door to that bedroom and wouldn't let anybody else in. His mother, Sarah Thornwell, showed up wanting to help. He turned her away. The pastor came by to offer prayers. Samuel told him to leave and pray from home. For 3 days, nobody was allowed in that house except Doc Patterson, and when Doc finally emerged on the 3rd day, he looked like he'd aged 20 years. His hands were shaking. He went straight to the saloon, and Doc Patterson never drank, and he poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and drank it in one gulp. When people asked him about the baby, he'd just shake his head and say, "There are some things man wasn't meant to see. Some things that make you question God's plan." See, the baby that Margaret gave birth to, there was something wrong with it. Fundamentally, terribly wrong. Now, the official story, the one the town was told, was that the baby was stillborn. Dead. Tragic accident. These things happen, especially with older mothers. Margaret was 36, after all. That's what everyone was told. But that ain't what happened. Ida Blackwell, before she left town 3 weeks later, told her sister what she saw. Her sister told me, well, she told this to a reporter in 1953, and that reporter wrote it down. Ida described the baby as wrong in ways that ain't got words. She said its cry wasn't like a normal baby's cry. It was too deep, too resonant, like it came from something much larger than a newborn infant. She said when she looked at it, her vision went blurry, like her eyes couldn't quite focus on it properly. Like it was rejecting being seen. And she said, and this part always gives me chills, she said it looked at her. Not the unfocused gaze of a newborn, but really looked at her, with understanding and something else. Something that made her so terrified she lost consciousness. 3 days after the birth, Samuel Thornwell walked out of his house at dawn, carrying a bundle wrapped in blankets. He went straight to the church and knocked on Pastor Green's door until the pastor answered. They talked in the pastor's study for over an hour. Nobody knows what was said in that conversation, but when Samuel left, Pastor Green looked like he'd aged 10 years. He immediately went to his knees in prayer and stayed there for 6 hours straight. A week later, Samuel announced to the town that Margaret had given birth to a healthy baby girl. Emily Rose Thornwell. Perfect in every way. The stillbirth story had been premature, he said. The baby had been weak at first, touch and go for a few days, but she'd pulled through. A miracle, really. Folks showed up with gifts, with food, with congratulations. Knitted blankets and hand-carved toys and jars of preserves. They wanted to see the baby, wanted to coo over her, wanted to welcome her into the community. But Samuel always had an excuse. She's sleeping. Margaret's not feeling well, needs her rest. The baby's got a cough, best not risk getting her sick. Doc says she's got a weak constitution, too many visitors might be overwhelming. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into a year. And nobody, not one single person, ever saw that baby. Martha Hendricks, the boldest of the town gossips, she tried showing up unannounced one day with a casserole. Samuel met her at the door, didn't invite her in. She tried to peer past him into the house, and she swore later that she saw movement in the shadows of the hallway. Something small and quick that didn't move like a child should move. Sarah Thornwell, Samuel's own mother, she tried demanding to see her granddaughter. Samuel refused. They had a screaming fight on the front porch where Samuel told his mother she was no longer welcome in his home. She died 6 months later, never having laid eyes on Emily. Some folks whispered that she died of a broken heart. Others said she died of relief that she'd never have to know the truth. By 1896, people were starting to talk. Really talk. Martha Hendricks, that town gossip I mentioned, she lived 2 houses down from the Thornwells. She swore she heard crying coming from their house at all hours of the night. Not normal baby crying, she said. The kind of crying that started out sounding like an infant and then shifted, changed pitch, became something else entirely. Sometimes it sounded like multiple babies crying. Sometimes it sounded like no baby at all. She told people that sometimes the crying would stop abruptly, cut off mid-wail, like someone had flipped a switch. And then, a few seconds later, laughter. Child's laughter, but wrong somehow. Too knowing. Jacob Mills, who delivered coal to most of the houses in town, he had his own stories. He claimed that one morning in winter of 1897, he was making a delivery to the Thornwell house. The sun wasn't up yet, and he was loading coal into the basement chute when he heard something moving down there in the dark. He shined his lantern down and saw Samuel, standing in the basement in his nightshirt, covered in blood. Samuel claimed he'd been butchering a pig. In the basement. In the middle of the night. In his nightshirt. Who the hell butchers a pig at 3 in the morning in their basement while wearing their nightclothes? Jacob didn't ask questions. He finished loading the coal and got the hell out of there. But he told his wife, and his wife told the pastor's wife, and soon everyone knew that Samuel Thornwell was doing something strange in his basement. And then there was the smell. Multiple people reported a strange odor coming from the Thornwell property, especially in the summer months. Sweet and rotten at the same time. Like meat left out too long in the heat, like flowers dying in a vase of old water. That specific smell of decay covered up with something trying to mask it. Samuel blamed it on the butcher shop, said he was experimenting with new curing techniques, new ways to preserve meat for longer periods. But the thing is, the shop was 100 feet from the house, and the shop smelled fine. Normal. Like fresh sawdust and raw meat and smoke from the smokehouse. The smell was coming from the house itself. People started avoiding the Thornwell property. They'd cross the street rather than walk past it. Mothers would pull their children to the other side of the road. Dogs would whimper and pull at their leashes when they got near. And Margaret? Margaret had become a ghost. She'd always been quiet, but now she barely existed. She'd leave the house maybe once a week for church, and even then, Samuel would escort her like she might run away if he let go of her arm. She lost weight, a lot of it. By 1898, she looked skeletal, her eyes sunken into her skull, her skin gray and papery. People tried to talk to her. Asked if she needed help, if everything was all right. And Margaret would just smile this brittle, broken smile and say, "I'm blessed. So blessed. My daughter is perfect. Absolutely perfect." But her eyes told a different story. Her eyes were screaming. Clara Jensen, who sat next to Margaret in church, she told people that Margaret would pray non-stop during service. Not the normal prayers, not the hymns everyone else sang. She'd whisper under her breath, the same words over and over, take it away, please God take it away." Clara asked her once what she was praying for. Margaret grabbed Clara's hand, gripped it so hard it left bruises, and whispered, "If you love your children, Clara, never let them play near my house. Never. Promise me." Clara promised. And she told everyone with kids to keep them away from the Thornwell property. Most folks listened. Fast forward to 1902. 7 years after Emily's birth. A traveling photographer named Chester Lloyd came through Ashford Hollow in June. Chester was 35, a former newspaper photographer from Philadelphia who decided to make more money doing portraits for families in small towns. He had a good setup, a nice camera, quality equipment, a professional eye for composition. He'd been working his way through western Pennsylvania for 3 years, and business was good. People wanted photographs. They wanted something to remember their families by, something to pass down to their children. Chester knocked on doors, showed samples of his work, quoted fair prices. Most families agreed. He'd been in Ashford Hollow for 3 days, had done maybe 15 portraits, when he knocked on the Thornwells' door. It was noon on a Tuesday, June 17, 1902. Hot day, clear sky, perfect light for photography. Samuel answered. They talked on the porch for maybe 10 minutes. Chester showed him samples, talked about preserving family memories, about having something to pass down to his daughter. And to everyone's shock, because Samuel Thornwell had refused all visitors, all social calls, all attempts to document his family for 7 years, Samuel agreed. Said he wanted a portrait taken right outside the butcher shop. Show off his business, show off his family. Prove to everyone that he was a successful man with a successful life. Chester set up his camera around 2 p.m. He positioned Samuel in front of the shop, told him where to stand, how to pose. Samuel went inside and came back out with Margaret and Emily. This was the first time most of the town had seen Emily in person. A crowd gathered. Not obvious about it, but people found reasons to be on Main Street that afternoon. Women suddenly needed things from the general store. Men suddenly had business to discuss outside the post office. Everyone wanted a look at the Thornwell girl, the mysterious daughter who'd been hidden away for 7 years. Chester was setting up his shot, adjusting the angle, checking the light. He told Samuel to stand proud, told Margaret to smile, told Emily to stand between them. And then he looked through the camera lens. He froze. Chester Lloyd had been a photographer for 15 years. He'd photographed crime scenes for the Philadelphia Examiner. He'd documented accidents, fires, murders. He'd seen bodies pulled from the Delaware River. He'd photographed a man who'd been crushed by a factory machine, another who'd been shot in the face at point-blank range. Nothing had ever made him stop working. Nothing had ever made him hesitate. Until he looked at Emily Thornwell through that camera lens. He later told people, the few people he told before he disappeared, that looking at her through the lens was different than looking at her with the naked eye. Like the camera saw something that human eyes couldn't quite process. He almost didn't take the photograph. Almost packed up his equipment right then and there and left town. His hands were shaking. Sweat was dripping down his face even though it wasn't that hot. But he needed the money. He had a wife back in Philadelphia, had debts to pay. So he steadied his hands, said a quick prayer, and took the shot. One photograph. That's all. He didn't take a second one for safety like he usually did. Didn't take any variants with different poses. Just one single photograph. Click. The moment the shutter closed, Chester started packing up his equipment. Told Samuel the photograph would be ready in 2 days, he could pick it up at the boarding house. Samuel paid him $3, which was the going rate, and Chester left. But he didn't go back to the boarding house. He went straight to the saloon and drank 4 whiskeys in 20 minutes. Then he went back to the boarding house, locked himself in his room, and developed that photograph. When he pulled it from the developing solution and saw what appeared in that image, he vomited. Right there in his makeshift darkroom. Just threw up all over the floor and then sat there shaking for an hour. The next morning, Chester Lloyd packed up all his equipment, except that one photograph, and left town. Didn't say goodbye to the boarding house owner who he'd been friendly with. Didn't collect payment from the other families whose photographs he'd promised to deliver. Didn't even stop to wire his wife to tell her he was coming home early. He just vanished. Left behind all his work, all his money owed, all his professional reputation. But he kept that one photograph. Kept it for years, locked in a drawer, too scared to show anyone, too disturbed to destroy it, unable to forget what he'd captured. So what did Chester Lloyd see in that photograph? What was so horrifying that it made a hardened crime scene photographer abandon his entire livelihood and run? Let me describe it to you. Every detail. The photograph is a standard portrait of the time. Black and white, sepia-toned, about 8 inches by 10 inches. The composition is good, Chester knew what he was doing. The Thornwells' butcher shop provides the backdrop, you can see the painted sign above the door, the brick facade, the window display. Samuel Thornwell stands there on the left, looking proud. He's wearing his good suit, the one he wore to church. His mustache is waxed, his hair is combed. He's got one hand on his hip, the other hanging by his side. He looks like any successful businessman of the era. Normal. Margaret stands on the right. She's wearing a dark dress, high-collared, long-sleeved despite the summer heat. She's thinner than she should be, you can see it even in the photograph, the way her dress hangs loose on her frame. Her face is turned slightly toward the camera, and if you look closely, you can see she's not really smiling. Her mouth is in the shape of a smile, but her eyes are dead. Absolutely dead. And between them, holding her father's hand, stands Emily. 7 years old. White dress with lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Dark hair, parted in the middle and pulled back. Pale skin, so pale she almost glows against the darker tones of her parents' clothing. At first glance, she looks like any other 7-year-old girl from 1902. Pretty, even. The kind of child you'd expect to see in a family portrait. But if you look closer, and I mean really look, the way Chester Lloyd looked through that camera lens, you start to notice things. Her eyes are off. Not the color, you can't tell color in a black and white photograph. But the position. They're too far apart. Just slightly. Maybe a 1/4 inch too far on each side. It's subtle enough that your conscious mind doesn't immediately register it, but your subconscious does. That primal part of your brain that evolved to recognize faces, to distinguish safe from dangerous, it picks up on it immediately and starts screaming. Her smile is wrong. The corners of her mouth go up too far, stretching toward her ears in a way that human mouths don't naturally stretch. It looks almost painful, like her face is being pulled into that expression rather than forming it naturally. Her fingers are too long. You can see them clearly wrapped around Samuel's hand, and they're just wrong. Too many joints, or the joints are in the wrong places. They curl around his hand like spider legs. Her proportions are off. Her arms are slightly too long for her body. Her neck is slightly too thin. Her head is slightly too large. Each individual thing is subtle, barely noticeable, but together they create this unsettling impression that you're looking at something that's trying very hard to look human but doesn't quite understand how. But the worst part, the part that made Chester Lloyd sick, the part that disturbed everyone who later studied this photograph, is her shadow. In the photograph, the sun is directly overhead. It's June, it's 2 in the afternoon, the shadows should be short. Samuel's shadow is barely visible, pooling around his feet. Margaret's shadow is the same, just a dark smudge on the ground directly beneath her. But Emily's shadow? It stretches. It reaches. It extends behind her for at least 6 feet, maybe more, like the sun is setting instead of at its peak. The shadow is so dark it's almost black, darker than any shadow should be in midday sun. And if you look at the shape of that shadow, if you really examine it, it don't look like a little girl's shadow at all. It's too tall. The proportions are wrong. The head is elongated, the arms are too long, the body is too thin. And there's something else in that shadow. Something that looks like additional limbs, or protrusions, or something that shouldn't be there. Multiple people who've studied this photograph have reported the same thing: the longer you look at it, the worse it gets. Details you didn't notice at first start to emerge. Emily's dress has stains on it that look like blood. There's something clutched in her left hand that might be a doll or might be something else. The window of the butcher shop behind her seems to show a reflection that doesn't match what should be there. And her eyes, God, her eyes. Some people swear that if you look at the photograph long enough, her eyes seem to move. To track you. To follow you around the room. Chester Lloyd kept that photograph in a locked drawer for over 50 years. He told his wife about it once, just once, and she made him promise never to show it to her. He had nightmares about it for the rest of his life. Dreams where Emily stepped out of the photograph and visited him, stood at the foot of his bed with that too wide smile, those too far apart eyes, those spider-like fingers reaching for him. He died in 1954, and in his will, he left instructions that the photograph be burned. His son didn't follow those instructions. Instead, he sold it to a private collector for $200. That's how it ended up in circulation. That's how copies started being made. That's how the truth about Emily Thornwell couldn't stay buried anymore. Now, here's where the story gets even darker. If you can believe that. In 1905, 3 years after that photograph was taken, Margaret Thornwell died. Official cause of death, pneumonia. She was 46 years old. But the town doctor, Doc Patterson, the same guy who'd been there for Emily's birth, the same guy who'd walked out of that house looking 20 years older, he refused to sign the death certificate at first. He went to the sheriff, a man named Wade Cooper, and he told Cooper that Margaret's body showed signs of prolonged trauma. Bruises on her arms and legs that looked like restraint marks. Rope burns on her wrists and ankles. Scratches on her face and neck that looked defensive, like she'd been clawing at something or someone. Doc Patterson said Margaret hadn't died of pneumonia. He said she died of starvation and exhaustion. Said she weighed maybe 90 pounds when she died, her organs were failing, her body had essentially consumed itself. He said it looked like she'd been kept prisoner. Like she'd been locked up and slowly allowed to waste away. Sheriff Cooper went to Samuel Thornwell's house to investigate. Samuel met him at the door, calm as could be. Invited him in, showed him around. The house was clean, orderly, normal. Samuel explained that Margaret had been sick for a long time, had refused to eat, had wasted away despite his best efforts to care for her. Emily was there. 10 years old now. Sitting quietly in the parlor, reading a book. She looked up when the sheriff entered, smiled at him with that too wide smile, and went back to reading. Cooper later told folks that being in that house made his skin crawl. He couldn't explain why. Everything looked normal, but something felt wrong. He said the air was heavy, like breathing through wet cotton. He said Emily never blinked the entire time he was there, just kept her eyes on that book, but he could feel her watching him anyway. Doc Patterson was an old drunk by then. His reputation wasn't what it used to be. Samuel Thornwell was still a respected member of the community. The sheriff decided that Margaret had indeed died of pneumonia, complicated by her refusal to eat, some kind of melancholia, depression, a woman's ailment that couldn't be helped. The death certificate was signed. Margaret was buried on a Thursday. Small funeral. Only about 20 people showed up. Most folks in town had stopped associating with the Thornwells by then. The whispers, the rumors, the strange happenings, it was easier to just avoid them. Emily was there at the funeral. And this is documented, I ain't making this up. Multiple witnesses reported it to the sheriff afterward. During the entire service, Emily never blinked. Not once. She stood next to her father, holding his hand, wearing a black dress that was too small for her, like she'd grown recently and Samuel hadn't bothered to get her new clothes. She stared at her mother's casket with those too far apart eyes, smiling that too wide smile. Pastor Green tried to avoid looking at her while he gave the eulogy. He stumbled over his words, forgot entire passages of scripture he'd recited hundreds of times. Afterward, he told his wife he was retiring. He was 68 years old and had been planning to preach for a few more years, but after that funeral, he couldn't do it anymore. He died 8 months later. Heart attack. But the pastor's wife said he'd been having nightmares every single night after Margaret's funeral. Dreams about Emily standing at the foot of his bed, asking him why he'd let her be born, why he hadn't stopped her father from keeping her alive. After the funeral, Samuel and Emily went home. Everything seemed normal. Until 3 days later. Thursday night, November 3, 1905. Around 2 a.m. The entire town of Ashford Hollow woke up to screaming. Not just any screaming, Samuel Thornwell screaming. Shrieking. The kind of sounds you don't think a grown man can make. Terror and pain and something else, something beyond horror. And he was screaming words. People heard him clearly through the night air. Please. Please, I'm your father. I kept you alive. Please. And then, oh God. Oh God, no. Not like this. People ran out of their houses in their nightclothes. The church bell started ringing, nobody knew who was ringing it, but someone had the presence of mind to sound an alarm. Within 5 minutes, half the town was in the street, all rushing toward the Thornwell property. The screaming continued, getting weaker, turning into these wet, gurgling sounds. Like Samuel was drowning. Like he was being torn apart. Jacob Mills, the coal delivery guy, he was one of the first to arrive. He tried the front door, locked. Tried the windows, locked. All of them. The screaming was coming from inside the house, from the basement. More people arrived. They could hear Samuel begging. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have let you die. I should have let you die at birth. Please. Emily, please. And then, cutting through Samuel's screaming, they heard laughter. A child's laughter. Emily, laughing like this was all a wonderful game. The men started trying to break down the door. Took them a good 5 minutes, solid oak door, heavy lock. By the time they got it open, the screaming had stopped. Silence. The crowd, maybe 40 people now, half the adult population of the town, stood outside, nobody wanting to be the first to go in. The house was dark. Quiet. Sheriff Cooper arrived. He grabbed a lantern, pulled his pistol, and went inside. Jacob Mills and 2 other men went with him. They found Samuel in the basement. I'm not going to describe it in full detail. I don't think I could even if I wanted to. The official reports were sealed, and the men who saw it refused to talk about it for the rest of their lives. But I can tell you what made it into the historical record. Samuel Thornwell had been torn apart. Not cut. Torn. Like something had grabbed him and pulled him into pieces with its bare hands. Arms ripped from sockets. Legs twisted backward and separated from the body. His chest cavity was opened up, ribs splayed out like wings. But it wasn't just violence. It was deliberate. Methodical. The pieces of Samuel were arranged on the basement floor in a pattern. Almost decorative. Like someone had taken time to position everything just so. Blood everywhere. On the walls, painted in shapes that might have been symbols or might have been nothing. On the ceiling, dripping down in long streaks. Pooling on the floor, so much of it that it was still warm when they found him. And the smell, that same sweet, rotten smell that people had been complaining about for years, it was overwhelming. Like years of decay concentrated into one space. But Emily? Emily was nowhere to be found. They searched the basement, the whole house, every room, every closet, every crawlspace. Nothing. She'd vanished. The sheriff organized a search of the property. They found more in that basement as they looked. Horrible things. There were chains bolted to the walls. Heavy chains, the kind you'd use for livestock. A cage in the corner, big enough for a child. The inside of the cage was covered in scratch marks, deep gouges in the wood like something had been desperately, frantically trying to get out. Or maybe trying to get deeper in, to hide from something worse outside. Jars on shelves. Dozens of jars, all filled with formaldehyde or some other preserving agent. And inside the jars, parts. Organs. Things that looked almost human but not quite. Hearts with too many chambers. Lungs with extra lobes. Something that might have been a brain but was the wrong shape, the wrong size. And notebooks. Samuel had kept detailed records. Measurements. Observations. Sketches. Pages and pages documenting Emily's growth, her behavior, her needs. Samuel's journal, which they found hidden under the floorboards in his bedroom, was over 300 pages long. He'd been keeping it since the day Emily was born. Sheriff Cooper read it. Then he burned it. Told everyone it was too disturbing to keep, too dangerous to let exist. But before he burned it, he shared some of what he'd read with Doc Patterson and Pastor Green. And they told others. And eventually, enough of it got out that we know what was in there. According to Samuel's journal, what Margaret gave birth to in 1895 was not human. Not entirely. It looked almost human, close enough to pass at first glance, but wrong in fundamental ways. Samuel described it as an abomination against nature, something that shouldn't exist but did. He wrote that when it was born, it didn't cry like a baby. It made sounds that hurt to hear, frequencies that made people's ears bleed, that made dogs howl and horses panic. Doc Patterson had recommended they let it die. Told Samuel it would be a mercy, that the thing wouldn't survive anyway, that God had made a mistake and they should correct it. Pastor Green had prayed over it. Had begged God to take it back, to undo what had been done. He performed what was essentially an exorcism on a newborn infant, trying to drive out whatever was inside it. But Samuel couldn't do it. Couldn't let it die. Maybe it was pride, the Thornwell line, the Thornwell name, he needed an heir. Maybe it was madness, something about the thing's existence broke something in Samuel's mind. Maybe it was just the desperate hope that he could fix it, make it normal, make it human. So he kept it. He kept it locked in the basement for the first 2 years. Fed it. Tried to raise it. But it wasn't like raising a normal child. It didn't eat normal food. Samuel documented feeding it raw meat, blood, things he couldn't identify. It grew faster than it should have, learned faster than it should have. By the time it was 6 months old, it could walk. By a year old, it could talk. Not baby talk, full sentences, complex thoughts, things a 1-year-old shouldn't be able to understand. But it learned to mimic. That's what saved it, in a way. It learned to mimic human behavior. Learned to cry when it was supposed to cry, to laugh when laughter was appropriate. It studied its parents like a scientist studying specimens, figuring out how to pass as one of them. By the time Emily was 4 years old, she'd learned to pass as human. Almost. Close enough that Samuel felt comfortable letting her upstairs occasionally. Close enough that he could pretend he had a normal daughter. Close enough that he could take that photograph. But Margaret knew. Margaret had always known. From the moment she gave birth to it, from the moment she looked into its eyes and saw nothing human looking back, she knew. And it destroyed her. Samuel wrote about how Margaret would pray for hours, sometimes for days. She'd lock herself in her room and beg God to take the thing away, to kill her, to end the nightmare. She stopped eating because she couldn't bear to feed the thing that had come out of her body. Couldn't bear to participate in keeping it alive. She tried to kill it once. Samuel documented this in his journal. Emily was 3 years old. Margaret waited until Samuel was at the shop, then went down to the basement with a knife. She was going to stab it, end it, free herself. But Emily knew. Somehow, she knew what Margaret was planning. And when Margaret opened the cage, Emily smiled at her and said, in perfect, adult-like articulation, "You can't kill me, Mother. I'm part of you. If you kill me, you kill yourself." Margaret didn't try again after that. She just slowly wasted away, refusing to eat, refusing to engage with life, counting the days until she could escape. The journal entries from 1902 to 1905 are the most disturbing, according to those who read them. Samuel wrote about how Emily was changing. How she was growing in ways that weren't natural. How her proportions were becoming more wrong as she aged, not less. How he'd have to keep her locked up more often because she was attracting attention, because people were starting to notice. He wrote about her appetites. How raw meat wasn't enough anymore. How she'd killed the family dog in 1903 and eaten parts of it. How he'd found her in the basement one night, crouched over something he couldn't identify, her face covered in blood, smiling up at him. He wrote about her intelligence. How she was smarter than any child should be. How she'd read every book in the house by the time she was 8. How she could do mathematical calculations in her head that Samuel couldn't solve with paper and pencil. How she spoke to him in ways that made him question his own sanity. And he wrote about how she was watching him. Always watching. Even when he thought she was locked up, he'd feel her eyes on him. He'd wake up in the night and know she was standing outside his bedroom door, listening to him breathe. The last entries in the journal, the ones from late 1905 after Margaret's death, they're frantic. Barely legible. Samuel wrote that Emily was getting stronger. That the locks wouldn't hold her anymore. That she'd broken free 3 times in the past month, and each time he'd found her standing in his room, just staring at him. He wrote that she was growing additional limbs. Or maybe they'd always been there and she was just tired of hiding them. He couldn't tell anymore. Reality was becoming slippery around her. He wrote that she told him things. Secrets about the nature of existence that made his head hurt, made his ears bleed. She'd whisper to him about what she really was, where she really came from, and he'd scream until she stopped. The last entry in the journal, dated November 2, 1905, one day before Samuel died, it's just one sentence, written so hard the pen tore through the paper. She knows that I know what she really is, and tonight she told me she's going to show me what happens to fathers who try to keep their daughters caged. Emily Thornwell was never found. The search went on for weeks. Sheriff Cooper organized search parties that combed through every inch of forest for 5 miles in every direction. They searched every abandoned building, every cave, every hollow tree large enough to hide a child. Nothing. They brought in dogs from 3 counties over. Bloodhounds, tracking dogs, the best they could find. The dogs picked up Emily's scent in the house, followed it to the basement, and then they all did the same thing, they started whimpering, tucked their tails, and refused to go any further. Some of them pissed themselves right there. One of them, a champion tracker that had found dozens of missing people, went insane. Started attacking its handler, had to be shot. It was like Emily had simply vanished into thin air. No tracks, no trail, no sign of where she'd gone. But people kept reporting sightings. Mrs. Henderson saw a little girl in a white dress standing at the edge of the woods behind her house. She called out to her, thinking it might be Emily, thinking she might get the reward the sheriff had posted. The figure turned to look at her, and Mrs. Henderson swore it wasn't a little girl at all. She couldn't explain what it was, but she knew it wasn't human. She locked her doors and windows and wouldn't come out for 3 days. Tom Porter, who ran the general store, he was closing up shop one night when he saw someone looking in the window. A child's face, pressed against the glass. He thought it was Emily. He went to the door to grab her, but when he opened it, there was nothing there. Just handprints on the window. Small handprints. But they had too many fingers. And then people started disappearing. Over the next 2 years, 4 people vanished from Ashford Hollow. No bodies. No evidence. No witnesses. Just gone. First was Doc Patterson. December 1905, exactly 1 month after Samuel's death. Doc had been drinking more heavily than usual, telling anyone who'd listen that he should have killed that thing when it was born, that this was all his fault. His housekeeper found his house empty one morning. Bed hadn't been slept in. Door was wide open. Doc's medical bag was on the kitchen table, and next to it was a single white ribbon, the kind little girls wore in their hair. Doc Patterson was never seen again. Then it was Ida Blackwell, the midwife. She'd left Ashford Hollow after Emily's birth, moved 2 towns over, tried to forget what she'd seen. But in March of 1906, her sister received a letter from her. The letter said, "She found me. She knows I was there. Tell my children I love them. That was it. Ida disappeared that same day. Her house looked like there'd been a struggle, furniture overturned, dishes broken. But no blood. No body. Just gone. Pastor Green was 3rd. July 1906. He'd retired after Margaret's funeral, had been living quietly with his wife. One Sunday morning, his wife woke up to find him missing. His clothes were still in the closet. His shoes were by the bed. But he was gone. The only thing she found was a note in his handwriting on his bedside table: "I have to answer for my sins. I have to face what I allowed to live." His body was found 3 months later by hunters, deep in the woods, 10 miles from town. What was left of it? Animals had gotten to it, the sheriff said. But the hunters who found it said it didn't look like animal damage. It looked like he'd been pulled apart. Carefully. Methodically. The 4th person to disappear was Francis Thorne, Chester Lloyd's assistant. Chester had sent him to Ashford Hollow in 1907 to try to track down the Thornwell family, to get permission to publish the photograph. Chester had gotten spooked by it, but Francis was a skeptic. Didn't believe in any of this supernatural nonsense. He arrived in Ashford Hollow on a Tuesday. Sent Chester a telegram that evening saying he'd gotten some interesting information and would be returning Friday. Friday came and went. No Francis. They found his room at the boarding house untouched. His luggage was packed, ready to go. His train ticket was on the dresser. But Francis was gone. A week later, Chester received a package. Inside was Francis's camera. And one photograph. The photograph showed Francis, sitting in what looked like the Thornwell basement. He was alive in the picture, but terrified. Eyes wide, mouth open in a scream. And standing behind him, hands on his shoulders, was Emily. 10 years old. Smiling that too wide smile. Chester burned the photograph immediately. Then he burned his own copy of the original photograph. Then he sold all his equipment and never worked as a photographer again. By 1908, people were fleeing Ashford Hollow. Families packed up in the middle of the night and just left. Houses were abandoned, businesses were closed. The population dropped from 847 to less than 300 in just 3 years. The few who stayed didn't talk about what was happening. They kept their doors locked, their windows covered. They didn't go out after dark. They didn't let their children play outside unsupervised. And every few months, someone would see her. The girl in the white dress. Standing at the edge of the woods. Looking in windows. Walking down Main Street at midnight when no one else was around. She never aged. Years went by, and she always looked exactly the same. 10 years old. White dress. Dark hair. That smile. In 1910, the town council, what was left of it, made a decision. They would erase Emily Thornwell from history. Destroy all records of her existence. Make it so that future generations would never know what happened in Ashford Hollow. It was the only way, they thought, to end it. If nobody remembered her, if nobody knew about her, maybe she'd fade away. Maybe she'd stop. They went door to door, collecting family Bibles where births were recorded. They confiscated any documents that mentioned the Thornwells. They tore pages out of the church registry. They pulled birth certificates from the county records office. Samuel's house was demolished. Every brick, every board, every nail was burned. They salted the ground where it had stood. The butcher's shop was torn down too. They tried to burn it, but the wood wouldn't catch fire. They ended up having to dismantle it piece by piece and haul it all away. They tracked down Chester Lloyd in Philadelphia. Found him living in a small apartment, working as a clerk in a department store. They offered him $500, a fortune in those days, for the photographic plate and all copies of the image. Chester negotiated them up to $700. He needed the money, and he was happy to be rid of it. He gave them the plate, gave them the 3 copies he'd kept. Swore he'd never speak of it again. They thought they'd gotten them all. Every copy. Every record. Every trace of Emily Thornwell's existence. They held a town meeting in the church, one of the few times the church was full in those days, and everyone swore an oath. They would never speak of this again. Never tell their children. Never write it down. They would take it to their graves. Most of them did. By 1920, Ashford Hollow was a ghost town. Fewer than 50 people remained, most of them elderly, too poor or too stubborn to leave. The young people had all fled. No new families moved in. The town was dying. In 1924, the state officially declared Ashford Hollow abandoned. The post office closed. The school had already been shut down years earlier. The general store was boarded up. And then, over the next decade, someone, nobody knows who, systematically destroyed what was left. Buildings were torn down. Foundations were dug up. Trees were planted over where houses had stood. By 1935, Ashford Hollow was gone. Erased. Like it had never existed. But the photograph survived. In 1952, a woman named Ruth Hendricks died in a nursing home in Pittsburgh. Ruth was the daughter of Martha Hendricks, the town gossip from Ashford Hollow. Ruth had been 15 when Emily killed her father, or when Emily disappeared, depending on who you asked. When the nursing home staff cleaned out Ruth's belongings, they found a tin box hidden in the back of her closet. Inside was the photograph. Ruth's daughter, Helen, she looked at that image and immediately felt sick. She didn't know why. She'd never heard the story, Ruth had kept her oath of silence. But looking at that little girl in the white dress, Helen felt pure, instinctive terror. She showed it to her husband, a professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh named Robert Carlyle. He was fascinated by it. Not scared, not yet. Just intrigued by why a photograph would be hidden away like that. He started researching Ashford Hollow. And he found nothing. Or almost nothing. There were massive gaps in the town records. Missing pages in the church registrar. Birth certificates that had been torn out of the county ledger, leaving only torn edges and empty spaces. It was like someone had deliberately erased a chunk of the town's history. But Professor Carlyle was good at his job. He was persistent. He tracked down descendants of people who'd lived in Ashford Hollow. Most of them refused to talk to him. They'd inherited the silence from their parents, even if they didn't know why. But he found old newspaper clippings from neighboring towns. Brief mentions of troubles in Ashford Hollow. A suspicious death in 1905. Missing persons reports from 1906 and 1907. Nothing detailed, nothing specific, but enough to know that something had happened. And eventually, in 1953, he found Thomas Mills. Thomas was the son of Jacob Mills, the coal delivery man. Thomas was 89 years old in 1953, and he was dying of cancer. He'd been 12 years old when his father broke down the door to the Thornwell house that night. Thomas figured he didn't have long to live, and he was tired of carrying the secret. So he told Professor Carlyle everything. Every detail. Every horrible thing his father had told him before Jacob died insane in 1931, screaming about the girl in the white dress coming for him. Professor Carlyle spent 6 months interviewing Thomas, recording everything, taking notes. And then he published a paper about it. The Ashford Hollow Incident, Mass Hysteria or Suppressed History. The paper was detailed, well-researched, thoroughly documented. It included testimony from Thomas Mills, reproductions of the photograph, analysis of the missing records, everything. The academic community tore him apart. They called him a fraud. Said he'd fabricated the whole thing for attention. His colleagues turned on him. Students started avoiding his classes. The university began an investigation into academic misconduct. Professor Carlyle defended himself. Showed them his research, his sources, the photograph. But it didn't matter. The photograph was dismissed as a fake, a clever piece of darkroom manipulation. Thomas Mills was an old man with dementia, they said. The missing records were just bureaucratic incompetence. In 1954, the University of Pittsburgh asked for Professor Carlyle's resignation. He refused. They fired him. He couldn't find work anywhere. His reputation was destroyed. His wife left him. His children stopped speaking to him. And in 1956, Robert Carlyle walked into the woods outside Pittsburgh and hanged himself from a tree. But before he died, he made copies of the photograph. Dozens of them. And he sent them to libraries, historical societies, private collectors, universities all over the country. Sent them with letters explaining the full story, begging someone to believe him, to investigate further. Most of the copies were thrown away. But some survived. Some ended up in archives, filed away under local legends, or folklore, or unverified historical accounts. That's how the photograph survived. That's how the story couldn't be completely buried. Today, you can find copies of that photograph in archives across the United States. The original tin print is in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania's collection, item number AH, 1902-17. They keep it in a restricted section of their archive. You have to request special permission to view it, and even then, they only let you look at it for 15 minutes. Why 15 minutes? Because that's how long it takes before people start feeling sick. Headaches, nausea, vertigo. The archivists have learned that nobody should look at that photograph for more than 15 minutes at a time. Some people can't look at it at all. They glance at it and immediately look away, their brains refusing to process what they're seeing. Ashford Hollow, Pennsylvania. It don't exist anymore. The town was officially removed from all maps in 1940. If you look at modern maps of western Pennsylvania, there's just empty space where it used to be. The land is state forest now. Public land. And if you go there, if you hike into those woods, you'll find nothing. No ruins, no foundations, no sign that 847 people once lived there. But local hikers report weird things in that area. Feelings of being watched. The sensation of invisible eyes following them through the trees. Strange laughter in the distance that sounds like a child but isn't quite right. And occasionally, very occasionally, someone will claim to see her. A little girl in a white dress. Standing at the tree line. Watching. Smiling. Most people dismiss these as ghost stories. Urban legends. The kind of creepy tales that spring up around abandoned places. The mind playing tricks, the imagination running wild. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. The thing that makes me wonder if the people of Ashford Hollow were right to try to erase this from history. In 2019, a hiker named Marcus Webb found something in those woods. He wasn't looking for anything related to Ashford Hollow, he'd never even heard the story. He was just hiking, and his dog started digging at something. It was a section of old foundation, buried under decades of leaves and undergrowth. Stone and mortar, barely visible. Marcus reported it to the State Historical Society, thinking it might be interesting. When archaeologists came to excavate it, they found it was the foundation of a building. A commercial building, based on the size and construction. They cross-referenced old records and determined it was the site of Thornwell's butcher shop. In the basement of that foundation, they found bones. Lots of bones. Most were animal bones. Cows, pigs, chickens, sheep. What you'd expect from a butcher shop. They were catalogued and documented. But not all of them were animal bones. The archaeologists found human remains. At least 4 different individuals, based on the skeletal analysis. 3 adults and 1 child. They were mixed in with the animal bones, buried under the dirt floor, like someone had tried to hide them. Carbon dating put them around 1905 to 1907. Right in the middle of when people were disappearing from Ashford Hollow. The remains of the 3 adults showed signs of extreme trauma. Not the kind you get from an accident or even from a normal murder. The bones had been broken, twisted, pulled apart. One skull had been crushed so completely that the forensic anthropologist couldn't determine the cause of death. But the child's remains, those were different. The child was approximately 10 years old at time of death. The bones showed unusual abnormalities. The skull had eye sockets that were positioned too far apart, exactly like the descriptions of Emily from the historical accounts. The finger bones were elongated, with extra phalanges, extra joints that humans don't have. There were other anomalies too. The spine had too many vertebrae. The ribcage had an extra set of ribs. The skull had sutured patterns that don't match normal human development. The forensic anthropologist who examined them, Dr. Sarah Chen, she wrote in her preliminary report, "These remains show characteristics inconsistent with normal human development. Possible genetic disorder or developmental abnormality of unknown origin. Recommend further DNA analysis and consultation with medical geneticists." The DNA analysis was rushed through. They wanted answers. The results came back inconclusive. The samples were too degraded to provide clear results. 110 years in the ground will do that. But the geneticist, Dr. Michael Torres, he noted something strange in the partial sequences they did recover. He found markers that didn't match any known human genetic variations. Sequences that looked almost human but had insertions and deletions in places that should be highly conserved across all humans. He found what looked like genes that don't exist in the human genome. His official report was cautious, scientific. Partial sequences recovered show unusual characteristics that may indicate significant genetic abnormality or sample contamination. Further analysis recommended. But off the record, Dr. Torres told a colleague that he'd never seen anything like it. That the DNA looked like someone had taken human DNA and spliced in something else. Something that wasn't human. The state of Pennsylvania quietly shut down the excavation. They said it was to respect the sanctity of the remains, to allow the dead to rest in peace. They reburied everything and put up signs prohibiting further digging in the area. But word got around. Researchers wanted access to the remains for further study. They were denied. The DNA samples were sealed. The full reports were classified. One of the archaeologists on the dig, a woman named Jennifer Morris, she quit the field entirely after that excavation. She won't talk about what they found, but her colleagues say she had a nervous breakdown. She won't go near those woods anymore. Won't even drive through that part of Pennsylvania. Dr. Chen, the forensic anthropologist, she still works. But if you ask her about the Ashford Hollow remains, she'll change the subject. Once, at a conference, someone pressed her about it. She finally said, "Some things shouldn't be dug up. Some secrets should stay buried." And Dr. Torres, the geneticist? He published one more paper after analyzing those remains. It was about genetic chimeras, organisms with DNA from 2 different sources. Then he left academia and now works for a private genetics company. He won't discuss the Ashford Hollow case at all. The bones are in storage somewhere. Locked away in a state facility. The DNA samples are sealed. The full reports are classified. And the state has made it clear that no further research will be permitted. So that's the story of the butcher's daughter. A story that a whole town tried to erase. A story that ended careers, ruined lives, destroyed families. A story that, even now, more than a century later, people are still trying to bury. Was Emily Thornwell human? Was she something else? Some kind of genetic mutation, some developmental abnormality so severe that it created something that looked almost human but wasn't? Or was she something worse? Something that shouldn't exist? Something that slipped through somehow, born into our world but not of it? I don't know. Nobody knows. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. Because if you look at that photograph, if you really study it, if you let your eyes unfocus just slightly, you start to see other things. Things I haven't even mentioned. The way the bricks behind her seem to warp, like reality is bending around her. The way the other people in the background, the ones just passing by on Main Street, are all turned away, like they're instinctively avoiding looking at her even though they probably don't know she's there. The way her dress has patterns in it that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them. The way her hair seems to have too much volume, like there's something underneath it. And if you look at the photograph long enough, and I don't recommend this, but some people have done it, some people swear they can see her expression change. That smile getting wider. Those eyes moving, tracking you, following you as you move around the room. Multiple archivists who've handled the original photograph report the same phenomenon. They'll be cataloging it, documenting it, and they'll look away for a moment. And when they look back, they swear Emily has moved. Just slightly. Her head turned a fraction of an inch. Her hand positioned differently. They'll tell themselves it's their imagination. A trick of the light. Fatigue. But it happens every time. Every single person who spends time with that photograph reports the same thing. And here's something that really freaks me out. Something I found while researching this story. There are reports, unverified, anecdotal, but persistent, of people seeing a girl matching Emily's description in different parts of the country. Different times. Different decades. A girl in a white dress seen in Oregon in 1967. In Texas in 1983. In Maine in 1995. In California in 2008. Always the same description. 10 years old, dark hair, pale skin, white dress. Always standing at the edge of things, watching. Always alone. Always smiling. And always, within a few months of the sighting, someone in that area goes missing. No body. No evidence. Just gone. Could it be the same person? The same thing? Could Emily Thornwell, born in 1895, still be out there? Or is it something else? Something that Emily was just one instance of. Something that appears occasionally, in different places, wearing different faces, but fundamentally the same. I know what you're thinking. This is just a story. It's just old folklore blown out of proportion. There's no way this is real. And maybe you're right. Maybe Samuel Thornwell was just a madman who convinced himself his deformed daughter was a monster. Maybe the whole town went collectively insane, succumbed to mass hysteria, and created a legend out of nothing. Maybe the photograph is just an old picture, and the weird things people see in it are just pareidolia, our brains finding patterns where none exist. Maybe the bones they found are just unfortunate victims of a regular murderer, and the abnormalities are just rare genetic disorders that we don't fully understand yet. Maybe. But then I think about those 4 people who disappeared after Samuel died, all of them witnesses to Emily's existence. I think about Chester Lloyd, who photographed crime scenes for years without flinching, running away from a single portrait. I think about Doc Patterson and Pastor Green, both men of science and faith, both terrified of what they'd seen. I think about Professor Carlyle, who destroyed his career and eventually his life trying to expose this story. Why would he do that for a made-up tale? What did he see in that photograph that convinced him it was worth losing everything? And I think about the fact that nobody, not one single person, ever found Emily Thornwell. She vanished in 1905, and she's still gone. No body. No grave. No record of her death. She's still out there. Somewhere. Or something is. One last thing before I go. And this is the part that really keeps me up at night. In 2021, someone uploaded a photograph to a paranormal investigation forum. The person who posted it was hiking in the woods of western Pennsylvania. They'd stopped to take pictures of some interesting rock formations. They didn't notice anything unusual at the time. But when they got home and looked at the photographs on their computer, they saw something in the background of one of them. A little girl in a white dress. Standing maybe 30 feet away, partially obscured by trees. The photograph was blurry, taken with a phone camera, zoomed in heavily, but you could make out the white dress, the dark hair, the pale skin. And if you looked closely, if you really examined that blurred figure, you could see that she was smiling. The hiker who took the photograph reported it to the state park rangers. They investigated. They found the exact spot where the photograph was taken, based on the rock formations visible in the image. And they found footprints. Small footprints. A child's footprints. Bare feet, pressed into the soft earth. But here's the thing that made them stop the investigation immediately. The footprints had too many toes. Sweet dreams, everyone. This has been Midnight Scripture. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's darkest forgotten stories, smash that like button, subscribe for more tales that'll keep you up at night, and drop a comment telling me what you think really happened in Ashford Hollow. Have you ever seen something you couldn't explain? Ever felt like you were being watched in the woods? Ever had that primal feeling that something isn't quite right, that something inhuman is nearby? Let me know in the comments. Because based on the research I've done, based on the reports I've read, I'm starting to think Emily Thornwell isn't the only one. I think there are others. And I think they're still out there. Next week, I'm gonna tell you about another forgotten photograph. Another dark secret that people tried to bury. Another story that'll make you question what you think you know about reality. Until then, stay safe out there. Keep your doors locked. Your windows covered. And if you're ever hiking in the woods and you see a little girl in a white dress standing in the distance, watching you, smiling at you, run. Don't ask questions. Don't try to help her. Don't take her picture. Just run. I'll see you in the next one.